On a cold afternoon in December of 1991, a young woman in a small town in Utah walked down her driveway to her mailbox. She was bundled up against the freezing winter air, her mind occupied by the stress of the past week. Her husband had vanished without a trace just 7 days earlier, leaving behind no clues and a family that was absolutely devastated. When she reached the mailbox, she pulled out a stack of letters and began sorting through them. Among the junk mail and the regular flyers, she noticed a credit card bill. It was addressed to her missing husband. This immediately struck her as incredibly strange because, as far as she knew, her husband did not even own a credit card. They shared all their finances, and they were constantly struggling to pay their bills, so there was no reason for him to have a secret account. Out of curiosity and growing concern, she ripped open the envelope and began reading the charges. As she scanned the list of transactions, she felt her heart drop. She realized that her missing husband had not only been keeping a major financial secret from her, but he might have been living a completely double life that she knew absolutely nothing about. To understand how she got to this point, we have to go back to the evening of December 10th, 1991. Around 6:30 in the evening, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff was sitting inside a tiny guard shack at the Kennecott copper mine in northern Utah. The shack was barely large enough for a single desk and a chair. It had large glass windows on all four sides, which normally would have given Brian a clear view of his surroundings. But on this night, the sun had set hours ago and the mine was pitched in absolute darkness. There were no street lights or nearby buildings to illuminate the area. The only thing visible was the faint white glow of the snow on the ground, reflecting what little moonlight managed to pierce through the heavy winter clouds. Brian had been working as a security guard for the mining company for a little over a year. It was a decent job that paid the bills, but he had only been stationed at this specific guard shack for a couple of weeks. In his opinion, this was the absolute worst post on the entire property. His job was to guard a heavy chain-link gate that blocked a remote service road leading deep into the canyons. Because it was so out of the way, almost no vehicles ever used this entrance. This meant his shifts were incredibly quiet and boring. But at the same time, the isolation made the post feel highly dangerous. The Kennecott copper mine was widely known as one of the richest mining operations on the planet. It was a massive open-pit mine that produced huge quantities of copper, gold, and silver. Because of the immense value of the materials stored on the property, the mine was a constant target for professional thieves. In the months leading up to December, more than $150,000 worth of expensive equipment and valuable metals had been stolen from the property. This put all the security guards on high alert. Brian was particularly nervous because he was completely unarmed. He did not carry a gun or even a nightstick. There were no security cameras monitoring his gate. If he ran into a group of thieves, his only option was to run back inside the shack and use the landline telephone on his desk to call for help. On this particular evening, however, everything was quiet. Brian was trying to make the most of the boring shift by studying. He was enrolled in nursing school and his final exams were scheduled to take place in just a few days. He had his heavy medical textbooks spread out across the desk and he was taking detailed notes under the dim light of a desk lamp. To keep himself warm and awake, he had packed a thermos filled with hot soup for his dinner. Just as he unscrewed the lid of the thermos and took his first sip, the telephone on the desk began to ring. Brian hesitated for a second before answering. He knew the person on the other end was almost certainly his wife, Jennifer. But at this point in his life, things at home were incredibly strained. Jennifer worked long hours as a nurse's aide to help support the family while Brian went to school during the day and worked the night shift at the mine. They were both physically exhausted and despite working multiple jobs, they were barely making enough money to pay their rent and buy groceries. To make things even more stressful, Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. The financial pressure and the lack of sleep had taken a massive toll on their marriage. Just 1 month earlier, Brian had reached a complete breaking point. The stress of his responsibilities had crushed him, and he decided to walk out on his family. He wrote a short note for Jennifer, packed a small bag, and drove away. He went straight to the mining office, turned in his security badge, and told his supervisor that he was quitting his job effective immediately. Then, he got in his car and drove all the way to Las Vegas. He spent several days there before driving even further west to San Francisco, completely cutting off all contact with his family. While he was in San Francisco trying to figure out what to do with his life, Brian received a message from a relative. His young daughter back in Utah had been rushed to the emergency room with a severe case of pneumonia. The news acted like a sudden splash of cold water. He realized how incredibly selfish he had been by abandoning his wife and child when they needed him most. He immediately got into his car, he drove straight back to Utah, and went to the hospital to be with his family. Fortunately, his daughter made a full recovery, and Jennifer, out of the goodness of her heart, agreed to take him back. His supervisor at the mine even agreed to give him his job back. But even though Brian was back home, things were far from normal. There was a constant, heavy tension hanging over the household. Jennifer was hurt and deeply distrustful of him, and Brian felt an immense amount of guilt for what he had done. So, when the phone rang in the guard's shack, Brian took a deep breath, picked up the receiver, and greeted his wife. They spoke for a few minutes about the kids and how his studying was going, but the conversation was suddenly cut short. Brian looked through the glass window of the shack and saw a pair of bright headlights moving slowly down the dirt road toward his gate. He told Jennifer that a car was approaching and that he had to go check it out. He hung up the phone and stepped out into the freezing night. About an hour and a half later, around 8 o'clock in the evening, Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, drove up to the gate of the remote guard shack. He was conducting a routine patrol of the property to check on the guards. As he pulled up, he noticed that the lights inside Brian's shack were turned on, but he could not see anyone sitting at the desk. Todd found this highly unusual. The golden rule for security guards at the mine was that they were never, under any circumstance, allowed to leave their designated posts. Todd parked his truck next to Brian's car, which was parked right beside the shack. He noticed that the engine of Brian's car was cold, meaning it had been sitting there for hours. If Brian had left, he certainly had not driven away in his own vehicle, and given how incredibly cold it was outside, it made no sense for Brian to have walked away into the dark desert canyons on foot. Todd walked up to the shack, opened the door, and stepped inside. The small space was empty. Todd looked at the desk and saw Brian's nursing textbook open to the chapter he had been studying. Next to the book was Brian's security hat and his thermos of soup, which was still half full. Everything looked as if Brian had just stepped out for a single second and intended to return immediately, but he was nowhere to be found. Todd walked outside and called out Brian's name into the darkness, but his voice just echoed off the canyon walls. There was no response. Feeling a deep sense of dread, Todd went back into the shack, picked up the phone, and dialed the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department to report his guard missing. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig was driving his patrol car down a snowy, winding road toward the Kennecott copper mine. When the call about a missing security guard came in, the Sheriff's Department took it very seriously. They knew all about the recent high-value thefts at the mine, and they immediately worried that Brian might have crossed paths with a group of dangerous criminals. Perhaps he had caught someone trying to break through the gate, and they had kidnapped him to prevent him from calling the police. As Detective Lassig approached the main entrance of the mine, he saw a vehicle parked on the side of the road with its headlights flashing. A man in a security guard uniform rolled down his window and waved the detective over. Lassig pulled up alongside the car, and the driver introduced himself as Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had made the emergency call. Todd told Lassig to follow him, and then he started his engine and drove off into the dark canyons. Lassig followed the supervisor's taillights for about 10 minutes, navigating the treacherous, icy roads that wound through the massive mining property. Finally, they arrived at the isolated guard shack. The two men got out of their vehicles, and Lassig immediately turned on his flashlight to inspect the ground around the shack. He was hoping to find footprints or tire tracks that might show him which direction Brian had gone, or if another vehicle had pulled up to the gate. But the snow had been falling steadily all evening, and a fresh white blanket had completely covered the ground, erasing any potential physical evidence. Lassig walked into the guard shack to examine the interior. The scene was exactly as Todd had described. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no overturned chairs, and no broken glass. But the presence of Brian's hat, his open textbooks, and his half-eaten dinner made it abundantly clear that Brian had not planned on leaving his post. While Lassig was looking around the room, trying to piece together what could have happened, the telephone on the desk suddenly began to ring. Lassig stepped over and picked up the receiver. He identified himself as a detective with the Sheriff's Department and asked who was calling. The woman on the other end sounded startled. She said her name was Jennifer Ruff and that she was trying to reach her husband, Brian. Lassig gently explained to her that Brian was currently missing and that they were actively searching the property for him. He then asked her when she had last spoken to her husband. Jennifer told him that she had called Brian about 2 hours earlier, around 6:30. She said they were in the middle of a normal conversation when Brian suddenly stopped and said he saw a car coming down the service road toward his gate. He told her he had to hang up to see who it was, and that was the last time she had heard from him. Lassig asked if Brian had mentioned what kind of car it was or if he sounded scared, but Jennifer said he didn't give any details. He just seemed calm and professional. Lassig thanked her for the information, promised to call her the moment they found anything, and hung up the phone. But just a few seconds after Lassig set the receiver back down on the cradle, the telephone rang again. Lassig picked it up, expecting it to be Jennifer calling back with more information. Instead, a female voice on the line asked to speak with Brian. Lassig explained once again that he was a detective and that Brian was missing. The woman on the line seemed confused and then claimed that she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. Lassig froze. He had literally just hung up the phone with Jennifer Ruff less than a minute ago. He listened closely to the voice of this second caller, and he realized it sounded completely different from the first woman. Furthermore, this second woman had absolutely no idea that she had just spoken to a detective. It was immediately obvious to Lassig that this was a completely different person. One of these women was the real Jennifer Ruff, and the other was an imposter who was lying about her identity. Lassig asked the second woman a few more questions, but she quickly became evasive, realized she had made a mistake, and abruptly hung up the phone. A few days later, Detective Lassig sat at the dining room table inside the Ruff home, holding a warm cup of coffee. He was looking across the table at Jennifer Ruff, who looked exhausted and pale. The search at the mine had turned up absolutely nothing. Search teams had combed the surrounding canyons on foot and with tracking dogs, but the heavy snow had made the search incredibly difficult, and there was still no sign of Brian. Lassig had already verified that the first phone call to the guard shack had come from the hospital where Jennifer worked. Her coworkers confirmed that she had been on duty and at her station all night, which proved she was indeed the real Jennifer Ruff. This meant the second caller was definitely an imposter. Lassig looked at Jennifer and decided to ask her a very difficult question. He asked if there was any possibility that Brian was having an affair, or if there was another woman in his life who might have a reason to call him at work and pretend to be his wife. Jennifer looked down at her hands, silent for a moment. Then she looked up at the detective and admitted that she had been harboring strong suspicions about Brian's fidelity. She reminded Lassig about the week-long period in November when Brian had walked out on the family. She explained that she had recently received a credit card bill in the mail addressed to Brian. She had never seen this credit card before, and when she opened the statement, she saw charges for expensive hotels, fancy dinners, and room service in Las Vegas and San Francisco. The amounts being charged were far too high for just one person. It was clear to her that Brian had not spent that week alone. He had been traveling with another woman. Jennifer then stood up, walked over to the kitchen counter, and retrieved a piece of paper. It was the family's landline phone bill from the past month. She pointed to a specific phone number that had appeared dozens of times on the bill. Many of the calls had been made late at night or during hours when she was at work. She told Lassig that she did not recognize this number at all, and she believed it belonged to the woman Brian was seeing. Lassig took the phone bill and looked at the number. He immediately recognized it. When he had traced the incoming calls to the guard shack from the night of Brian's disappearance, the second call, the one from the imposter who claimed to be Jennifer, had come from this exact same phone number. Later that afternoon, Detective Lassig drove to a modest house in a residential neighborhood not far from the mine. He walked up to the front door and knocked. A young woman opened the door and Lassig introduced himself. Her name was Christy Bradley. Lassig knew from his background checks that Christy was married to a man named Dale Bradley, who also worked as a security guard at the Kennecott copper mine. He was a co-worker of Brian's. Dale was not home at the time, which was exactly what Lassig had hoped for. He wanted to speak to Christy alone. Lassig sat down with Christy in her living room and did not waste any time playing games. He pulled out the phone records and the credit card statements and laid them on the table. He told Christy that he knew she was having an affair with Brian Ruff, and he knew that she was the one who had called the guard shack on the night he disappeared. Christy stared at the documents on the table, her face turning pale. She realized there was no point in denying it. She broke down in tears and admitted everything. She confessed that she and Brian had been seeing each other secretly for several months. She confirmed that she was the one who had traveled with him to Las Vegas and San Francisco during the week he had walked out on his family. She explained that on the night of December 10th, she had been missing Brian and decided to call him at the guard shack just to hear his voice. But when a man answered the phone and identified himself as a police detective, she had completely panicked. She knew that if the police investigated her call, her husband Dale would find out about the affair, and her marriage would be completely over. So, on a desperate impulse, she lied and told the detective that her name was Jennifer. She hoped that would satisfy his questions and prevent any further investigation. Christy sobbed as she spoke, insisting to Lassig that she had no idea where Brian was. She said she loved him and was terrified that something terrible had happened to him. Lassig watched her closely. He could tell that her grief and worry seemed entirely genuine. She did not appear to be hiding any knowledge about Brian's whereabouts. But the fact remained that her husband, Dale Bradley, was Brian's co-worker. If Dale had somehow discovered the affair, he would have had an incredibly strong motive to harm Brian. The next morning, Dale Bradley walked into the sheriff's station for an interview. He sat down across from Detective Lassig in a small interrogation room. Dale seemed calm and cooperative. He immediately asked Lassig if there were any updates on the search for Brian, expressing concern for his friend. He told Lassig that he and Brian had worked together for a year and had become quite close, often hanging out outside of work. Lassig decided to deliver the blow directly. He told Dale that the police had discovered Brian was having an affair and that the other woman was Dale's wife, Christy. Dale's reaction was one of complete and utter devastation. He stared at Lassig, his jaw dropping and his eyes filling with tears. He seemed completely blindsided by the revelation that his wife was cheating on him and that she was doing it with a man he considered to be a close friend. He put his head in his hands and shook his head in disbelief. Once Dale managed to compose himself, Lassig asked him where he had been on the night of December 10th, between the hours of 6 and 8 in the evening. Dale wiped his eyes and explained that he had been miles away from the mine. He said he had driven his red Ford Mustang to the University of Utah campus in Salt Lake City to run some errands. While he was there, a heavy snowstorm hit and his car got severely stuck in a deep snowdrift in one of the campus parking lots. He said he was stuck there for hours and eventually had to call a close friend to drive out with a shovel and a tow strap to help pull his Mustang out of the snow. Dale gave Lassig the name and phone number of the friend who had helped him. Lassig thanked him for his cooperation and asked Dale if he would be willing to take a polygraph test and allow the police to search his red Mustang. Dale did not hesitate. He agreed to both requests immediately, saying he had absolutely nothing to hide and wanted to help find whoever had hurt Brian. Over the next few weeks, the investigation continued to stall. Dale Bradley's friend was contacted and he fully corroborated Dale's story. He confirmed that he had received a call from Dale on the night of December 10th, asking for help because his red Mustang was stuck in the snow at the university. The friend had driven out, found Dale and his car exactly where he said they were, and helped pull him free. This gave Dale a seemingly airtight alibi for the time of the disappearance. Furthermore, both Dale and his wife, Christy, passed their polygraph examinations with flying colors. The examiners found no indications of deception when they were asked if they had any involvement in Brian's disappearance. Lassig's team also thoroughly searched Dale's red Mustang. They looked for blood, hair, fibers, or any signs that Brian had been inside the car, but the vehicle was completely clean. With no physical evidence linking Dale to the crime and with a confirmed alibi, the detective had no choice but to shift his focus elsewhere. Lassig began to look closely at the other security guards at the mine, specifically those who had been implicated in the massive theft ring. He wondered if Brian had stumbled upon an active heist on the night of December 10th. If Brian had walked out of his shack to inspect the approaching vehicle and found his co-workers loading stolen metals into a truck, they might have killed him to keep him from reporting them. Lassig decided to pay another visit to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows. He met Todd at his office at the mining property. Todd was extremely welcoming and expressed a strong desire to help the police solve the mystery. Lassig sat down, turned on his tape recorder, and began asking Todd about the security guards who had recently been arrested for the thefts. Todd admitted that he knew about the arrests, but he adamantly denied having any personal involvement in the stolen property ring. He then began to offer up several highly detailed theories about what might have happened to Brian. He leaned forward in his chair and suggested that if the thieves had indeed killed Brian, they would have wanted to dispose of his body in a way that ensured it would never be found. Todd pointed out several specific areas on the mining property where a body could be hidden permanently. He suggested that the killers might have thrown Brian's body into the massive gravel pile next to the mineral concentrator. He explained in detail how the heavy machinery would have dragged the body into the industrial grinders, completely pulverizing it along with the copper ore until there was absolutely nothing left. Then, Todd offered another theory. He suggested that Brian might have been buried beneath the massive waste piles on the edge of the property. He explained that hundreds of tons of crushed rock and dirt are dumped onto those piles every single day. If Brian was placed at the bottom of one of those piles, he would have been buried under a mountain of rock within hours, making it physically impossible for the police to ever find his remains. Lassig listened to Todd's explanations with a growing sense of suspicion. It seemed highly unusual that a supervisor would have spent so much time thinking about the exact mechanics of how to destroy a human body using the mine's machinery. It felt as if Todd was trying to subtly tell the police that searching for Brian was a waste of time because his body had already been completely destroyed. However, as the months rolled by, the investigation into the theft ring revealed that while Todd Fallows was indeed involved in the thefts, there was absolutely no evidence linking him or any of the other thieves to Brian's disappearance. All the guards who were working on the night of December 10th had confirmed alibis, and none of them had been absent from their designated areas for long enough to commit a murder and dispose of a body. The case slowly began to grind to a halt. There were no new leads, no eyewitnesses, and most importantly, no body. Without a body, the prosecutors could not file murder charges against anyone, even if they had a suspect. Jennifer Ruff was left to raise her young daughter and prepare for the birth of her second child all by herself, carrying the heavy weight of not knowing whether her husband was dead or had simply run away again a year and a half past. On July 10th, 1993, a group of campers was exploring a remote, barren patch of desert in Juab County, Utah. This area was incredibly isolated, located about 50 miles south of the Kennecott copper mine. While they were walking through the sagebrush, one of the campers noticed something unusual sticking out of the sandy dirt. They walked over to inspect it and realized, to their absolute horror, that they were looking at a human skull. They immediately left the area and drove to the nearest town to contact the local sheriff's department. When Detective Manny Lassig received the news that a skeleton had been found in the desert, he immediately got in his car and drove to the location. He had spent the last 18 months thinking about Brian Ruff every single day, and he had a strong feeling that this discovery was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. When Lassig arrived at the scene, the forensics team had already cordoned off the area with yellow crime scene tape. Lassig walked over to the shallow grave and looked down. The skeleton was lying on its side, partially exposed by the wind and rain that had eroded the soil over the past year and a half. The remains were still clothed in a dark blue jacket. Even though the fabric was faded and covered in desert dust, Lassig could clearly see the security emblem on the sleeve. It was a Kennecott copper mine security uniform. Lassig put on a pair of latex gloves, knelt down in the dirt, and carefully reached into the pockets of the jacket. His fingers brushed against a thick leather object. He pulled it out and saw that it was a wallet. He opened it up and looked at the driver's license inside. The face staring back at him was Brian Ruff. While the forensic investigators began the slow, delicate process of excavating the remains, Lassig and a team of officers searched the surrounding area for any clues. Just a few feet away from the shallow grave, Lassig spotted something metallic glinting in the dirt. He walked over and found 5 spent shotgun shells lying close together in the brush. It appeared that someone had stood over the grave and fired 5 shots. A short distance away, a tracking dog began barking loudly, drawing Lassig's attention to a patch of thick weeds. Lassig walked over and saw a single black work boot lying in the dirt. When he picked it up, he noticed a clean, round hole blasted straight through the leather near the ankle. It was a bullet hole. The killer had shot Brian multiple times, and at least one of the blasts had struck him in the foot. The finding of the body was a massive development, but it did not immediately solve the case. The desert elements had spent 18 months destroying any potential DNA, fingerprints, or footprints that the killer might have left behind. The shotgun shells were of a common variety, and it was impossible to trace them to a specific weapon without the actual gun. The dental records officially confirmed that the remains were indeed those of Brian Ruff, and the medical examiner ruled his death a homicide caused by multiple shotgun wounds. But with no new leads, the case once again went completely cold. The file was placed back into a box in the Sheriff's Department archives, where it sat untouched for more than a decade. Fast forward to April 30th, 2005. A detective named Todd Park was sitting at his desk at the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. Park had recently been assigned to the department's cold case unit, and his entire job was to review unsolved homicides and see if modern forensic technology or new information could help bring closure to the victims' families. On that morning, the telephone on Park's desk rang. It was a detective from a neighboring county. The detective explained that he was currently investigating a recent homicide. A young woman named Crystal Bradley had been found murdered, and her husband was the primary suspect in her death. The husband's name was Dale Bradley. The neighboring detective told Park that during a routine background check on Dale Bradley, he had discovered that Dale's name had come up years ago in connection with an unsolved murder in Salt Lake County. He wanted to know if Park had any information about that old case. Park thanked the detective and immediately went to the archives to pull the file on the murder of Brian Ruff. He carried the heavy box back to his desk, blew the dust off the top, and began reading through the hundreds of pages of reports, interviews, and evidence logs from 1991 and 1993. As Park meticulously went through the old notes, he focused heavily on Dale Bradley. He read about the affair between Brian and Dale's first wife, Christy. He read about Dale's reaction to the news and how he had passed his polygraph test. And then, Park reached the section of the file detailing Dale's alibi from the night Brian disappeared. Dale had claimed that his red Ford Mustang had gotten stuck in the snow at the University of Utah campus, and his friend had confirmed that he drove out to help pull the car free. At the time, the original detectives had accepted this as a solid alibi because the friend had verified the story. But as Park stared at the report, a sudden realization hit him. The friend had indeed helped Dale get his car out of the snow on the night of December 10th, 1991. But the friend had only assumed they were at the university campus because that was what Dale had told him when he called for help. The friend was not familiar with the area, and it was pitched black outside in the middle of a heavy snowstorm. The friend had simply driven to the coordinates Dale had given him, hooked up the tow strap, pulled the Mustang out of the drift, and left. What if Dale had not been at the university campus at all? What if Dale's car had actually gotten stuck in the snow deep in the desert of Juab County, 50 miles south of the mine, right where he had just buried Brian Ruff? Park realized that if Dale had driven his red Ford Mustang out into the remote desert to dump Brian's body, and his car had become stuck in the snow there, he would have had to call his friend to come rescue him. To hide the crime, Dale would have simply lied to his friend about their location, leading him to believe they were on the outskirts of the university campus rather than in the middle of the desert. The friend, trusting Dale, never questioned the location in the dark, snowy conditions. This was a brilliant theory, but Park knew he needed physical evidence to prove it. He requested that all the physical evidence from the Brian Ruff case be brought up from the evidence vault. He laid out the clothing Brian had been wearing, the shotgun shells, and the single black work boot with the bullet hole through the ankle. Park took the black work boot and placed it under a powerful magnifying lens. He slowly turned the boot over, examining the thick rubber sole. As he studied the deep ridges of the tread, he spotted something incredibly tiny lodged deep inside one of the grooves. It was a microscopic fleck of red paint. The original investigators had noted the presence of the paint in their logs, but in 1993, they did not have the technology to analyze such a tiny sample, and they had dismissed it as random debris. But in 2005, forensic science had advanced significantly. Park carefully extracted the tiny speck of red paint and sent it to the State Forensic Laboratory for chemical analysis. At the same time, Park tracked down the red Ford Mustang that Dale Bradley had driven in 1991. Even though Dale had sold the car years ago, the police managed to locate the current owner and obtained permission to inspect the vehicle. The forensic scientists took samples of the original red paint from the inside of the Mustang's trunk lid. When they compared the chemical composition of the paint from the trunk to the microscopic speck found on the sole of Brian's boot, they discovered that they were an absolute perfect match. The chemical signatures, the pigments, and the specific manufacturer's formula were identical. This was the smoking gun. There was absolutely no reason for a microscopic fleck of paint from the inside of Dale Bradley's car trunk to be embedded in the sole of Brian Ruff's work boot unless Brian's boot had come into direct contact with the interior of that trunk. Based on this incredible piece of physical evidence, Detective Park was finally able to reconstruct exactly what had happened on the night of December 10, 1991. Around 6:30 in the evening, Dale Bradley, consumed by rage after discovering that his wife Christy was having an affair with his friend and co-worker, drove his red Ford Mustang to the remote guard shack at the Kennecott Copper Mine. He knew Brian was working the night shift alone at that isolated post. When Dale pulled up to the gate, Brian recognized his friend's car and stepped out of the shack to greet him, which explains why he told his wife on the phone that he had to go because a car was approaching. As soon as Brian walked up to the driver's side window, Dale pulled out a shotgun, forced Brian to his knees, and tied his hands tightly behind his back. Dale then forced Brian into the trunk of the red Mustang and slammed the lid shut. During the struggle, Brian's boot scraped against the inside of the trunk lid, transferring the tiny fleck of red paint to the rubber sole of his boot. Dale then got into the driver's seat and drove 50 miles south into the dark, barren desert of Juab County. When he reached an incredibly isolated spot, he dragged Brian out of the trunk. He handed Brian a shovel and, at gunpoint, forced him to dig a shallow grave in the frozen ground. Once the grave was deep enough, Dale raised his shotgun and fired 5 times, striking Brian in the chest and the foot. He then pushed Brian's body into the grave, covered it with dirt, threw the boot and the shells nearby, and prepared to drive away. But as Dale tried to accelerate onto the dirt road, the heavy snow caused his rear tires to spin, and the red Mustang became hopelessly stuck in a deep snowdrift. Knowing he could not leave the car there, Dale used a nearby payphone or his radio to call his friend. He lied about his location, telling his friend that he was stuck near the university campus, and guided him out to the remote desert location under the cover of the blinding snowstorm. The friend, completely unaware that a freshly buried body was lying just yards away in the dark, pulled the Mustang free, and the two men drove away. On September 19, 2005, Dale Bradley was officially arrested and charged with first-degree murder of Brian Ruff. The trial was highly publicized, and the evidence presented by Detective Park was overwhelming. In 2007, facing the prospect of life in prison without parole, Dale Bradley agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to the reduced charges of manslaughter and kidnapping. He was sentenced to serve up to 40 years in state prison. While the family of Brian Ruff finally received some semblance of justice after 16 long years of pain and uncertainty, the resolution of the case was bittersweet. The murder of Dale's second wife, Crystal Bradley, which had occurred in 2005 and ultimately led to the discovery of Brian's killer, remains officially unsolved to this day. The pain of her loss still hangs heavily over her loved ones, a stark reminder of the devastating wake of destruction that Dale Bradley left behind him. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.